Tiger versus 50 tanks. That's either one of the greatest tank victories in history or wartime propaganda. Let's find out which. Here's the thing about this battle. It has three versions. There's the German medal citation, written 2 days after the alleged engagement by officers with every reason to manufacture heroes. There's the Soviet counter-narrative, buried in archives that were themselves designed to hide embarrassing losses. And there's what the physical evidence and independent analysis actually suggests, which is considerably less certain than either side wants you to believe. What follows isn't a debunking. It's not a celebration either. It's an investigation into who wrote what, when they wrote it, and what they stood to gain from lying. And perhaps most importantly, what happened to the men inside that Tiger tank after the propaganda machinery finished grinding them into symbols. July 8, 1943. Somewhere in the churned mud southeast of Kursk, a 20-year-old Austrian tank commander named Franz Staudegger allegedly faced down a Soviet armoured assault and emerged with one of the most impressive kill tallies in the history of armoured warfare. 22 T-34 tanks destroyed in a single engagement. 2 days later, July 10, 1943, he received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Nazi Germany's most prestigious military decoration. Stop and think about that for a second. 48 hours. That's 48 hours during the most intense armoured offensive of the Eastern Front, for a decoration that theoretically required verification through the chain of command and personal approval from Adolf Hitler himself. Either the German military bureaucracy operated with superhuman efficiency during one of the war's most chaotic battles, or the award was predetermined and only required minimal documentation to justify what had already been decided. So let's look at what we actually have. The foundation of everything we think we know about this engagement rests on a single German military document, Staudegger's Knight's Cross citation. Understanding what this document is, and more critically, what it is not, requires understanding the bureaucratic and ideological machinery that produced it. Staudegger was serving as an SS Unterscharführer, roughly equivalent to a junior sergeant, in the 13th Heavy Company of SS Panzer Regiment 1, part of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The LSSAH wasn't merely a military formation. It was Adolf Hitler's personal guard division, a unit whose successes and heroes carried ideological weight far beyond their tactical significance. When the Leibstandarte's Tiger tanks went into action during Operation Citadel, any notable success would receive immediate attention from the Nazi propaganda apparatus. They needed heroes. They needed superhuman Germans crushing inferior enemies. They needed stories. Christopher Lawrence of the Dupuy Institute has conducted the most rigorous analysis of this engagement, using both German and Soviet archival sources. His conclusion is stark. The details of the event are unsupported by unit reports. That's not a minor methodological quibble. The German military, despite its reputation for meticulous record-keeping, did not apparently generate the kind of after-action documentation that would verify Staudegger's kill claims through independent observation, wreckage counting, or prisoner interrogation. No one went out and counted 22 burning hulks. No one photographed the field. No one interrogated surviving Soviet tankers to confirm what they'd just faced. What we have is a citation, likely based on Staudegger's own report or that of his immediate superior, processed through a system that had every incentive to produce heroes and no incentive to verify uncomfortable details. The 22 tank figure appears in the citation and has been repeated in every account since. But no document from July 1943 independently confirms that 22 Soviet tanks were destroyed by a single Tiger in that sector on that day. Now, if German sources are suspect because of Nazi propaganda motives, you might expect Soviet sources to provide a clean corrective. The reality is considerably messier. Soviet military record-keeping during the Great Patriotic War was extensive but served its own ideological purposes. Loss reports were frequently understated to avoid accusations of incompetence or defeatism. Unit strengths were sometimes falsified. Tactical defeats were reframed as strategic successes. The notion that Soviet archives provide a clear, objective counter-narrative to German claims reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how both systems operated. What Soviet archives do provide is a different set of problems, a different set of potential distortions. Lawrence's research attempted to identify which Soviet tank formation could have been attacking near Teterevino, the location associated with Staudegger's engagement on July 8, 1943. Multiple candidates existed in the sector: the X Tank Corps, the 31st Tank Corps, the 2nd Tank Corps, the 5th Guards Tank Corps, all operating in the southern portion of the Kursk salient, where the LSSAH was engaged. Soviet Operational Report No. 206 from the 1st Tank Army, dated 0700 on July 8, 1943, places the 31st Tank Corps with the attached 192nd Tank Brigade defending a line running through Krasnaya Polyana, height 252.5, and the western outskirts of Malye Mayachi and Greznoye. Combat Report No. 0112 from 2200 on July 8, 1943, identifies the X-Tank Corps' 178th Tank Brigade as the closest unit to where Staudegger's engagement allegedly occurred. Here's the problem. None of these Soviet reports describe an attack with 50 to 60 tanks being repulsed with 22 losses in the direction of Teterevino on July 8, 1943. Soviet records do document tank losses in this sector. They do record engagements with German armour, but they don't match cleanly to the specific narrative that German sources provide. This absence could mean several things. It could mean the engagement never happened as described, which would confirm the skeptics' suspicions. It could mean Soviet records understated losses to avoid blame, which would support the traditional narrative. It could mean the engagement occurred but involved fewer tanks than German sources claimed, which would suggest partial truth with propaganda exaggeration. Or it could mean the engagement occurred against a unit whose records haven't survived or been fully examined, which would leave the question permanently unresolved. Soviet Operational Report No. 208, dated July 9, 1943, states that 2 brigades of the 10th Tank Corps reached the fighting at 1600 and were ordered to deploy and attack the enemy. But this describes late afternoon action, not the concentrated morning or early afternoon engagement attributed to Staudegger. The timing doesn't line up. The geography is close, but not precise. The casualty numbers don't match. We're left trying to force Soviet documentation into the shape of a German narrative. And the documents resist. The broader statistical picture at Kursk complicates rather than clarifies. Soviet tank losses during Operation Citadel were massive. Credible estimates range from 1,600 to over 2,000 tanks destroyed across the entire operation. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps sector, where the LSSAH operated, saw intense fighting with significant Soviet armour committed to stopping the German advance. In this environment, the destruction of 22 T-34s in a single engagement isn't impossible. Tigers did achieve high kill ratios against T-34s. Multiple German tank commanders recorded double-digit kills during Kursk. But here's what people consistently miss. The statistical plausibility of an event isn't the same as verification that it occurred. The fact that something could have happened doesn't mean it did happen, particularly when the only source for the specific claim is the medal citation of the man who benefited from it. Understanding whether Staudegger's engagement was authentic, exaggerated, or fabricated requires understanding the broader system that produced and promoted German tank ace narratives. The Nazi propaganda apparatus had a well-documented practice of creating, embellishing, and promoting military heroes for domestic morale and ideological purposes. These aces, whether pilots, submarine commanders, or tank commanders, served to personify the alleged superiority of German men and German technology. Their stories appeared in newsreels, magazines, and radio broadcasts, creating the impression that the Wehrmacht was winning through individual valor, even as strategic reality increasingly suggested otherwise. The Tiger tank was particularly central to this myth-making. Germany's most advanced and intimidating armoured vehicle, the symbol of technological superiority. The case of Michael Wittmann provides the most instructive comparison. Wittmann served in the same battalion as Staudegger and later became the most famous Tiger commander of the war, credited with destroying over 130 tanks and assault guns during his career. Modern historical analysis has subjected Wittmann's record to intense scrutiny. The findings are sobering. Researchers have documented that propaganda accounts credited Wittmann with kills actually achieved by other tank crews. Photographs of his engagements were doctored or staged to create impressions of greater destruction. The German propaganda magazine Signal published manipulated images of his famous Villers-Bocage engagement that falsified the scale of his success. Wittmann was unquestionably a skilled and aggressive tank commander who achieved significant results, but the propaganda apparatus transformed a capable professional into an impossibly superhuman figure. The pattern with Tiger aces consistently shows initial reports being amplified through repetition. Specific details get added that weren't in original sources. Any evidence of failure or limitation gets suppressed. Staudegger's engagement fits this pattern precisely. The original claim of 22 tanks destroyed appears in his citation, but later accounts embellish with increasingly specific details. Facing 50 Soviet tanks alone, running out of ammunition and resupplying under fire, single-handedly stopping a Soviet breakthrough. Each retelling adds drama, while the core claim remains unverified. This isn't evidence that the engagement was fabricated, but it's evidence that the story as we've received it passed through a propaganda filter designed to maximize heroic impact rather than historical accuracy. Soviet propaganda operated with different methods but similar goals. Rather than celebrating individual heroes, the Soviet system emphasized collective achievement, industrial production, and the wisdom of Communist Party leadership. Individual tank commanders were occasionally highlighted, but the Soviet approach focused more on unit citations and group medals than on creating celebrity warriors. When Soviet sources discussed German equipment and tactics, they tended toward one of two extremes: either dismissing German technology as inferior to Soviet designs, or explaining German successes as the result of numerical advantage, surprise, or Western Allied assistance, rather than superior German skill. Neither approach was conducive to accurate casualty reporting. Admitting that a single German tank had destroyed 22 Soviet vehicles would have been ideologically problematic, regardless of whether it actually happened. Which means Soviet silence on the matter can't be taken as proof that it didn't occur. Both propaganda machines had reasons to lie, just in different directions. So who was Franz Staudegger before the propaganda machine got hold of him? He was born on February 12, 1923, in Unterleibach, a small village in Carinthia, Austria's southernmost state, bordering both Italy and Slovenia. He came of age during the final years of the First Austrian Republic, experienced the Anschluss of 1938, when Nazi Germany absorbed Austria into the Reich, and was 17 years old when he joined the SS in 1940. Like many young Austrians of his generation, he was swept into the Nazi military system during the years when German power seemed irresistible. Staudegger was assigned to the reserve battalion of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, which suggests either ideological commitment or exceptional physical and mental qualifications. The LSSAH maintained higher recruitment standards than most Waffen-SS units. His path to Tiger Command indicates demonstrated competence as a tank crewman, likely serving in progressively responsible positions before receiving command of one of the division's most valuable vehicles. By July 1943, when Operation Citadel began, the LSSAH possessed only 12 Tiger I tanks. 12, making each vehicle and crew a significant military asset. The assignment of a 20-year-old sergeant to command one of these machines reflects either exceptional ability, manpower shortages among experienced NCOs, or both. And that's when every other documentary stops. They tell you about the battle. They show you the Tiger. They cut to the museum. But what actually happened to these men? A Tiger I required a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator. On July 8, 1943, 4 men besides Franz Staudegger were inside that Tiger when it allegedly faced down 50 Soviet tanks. Their names don't appear in the Knight's Cross citation. Their names don't appear in the popular accounts. They have been erased from the story as completely as if they never existed. This erasure isn't accidental. It's structural. The personnel records of the 13th Heavy Company of SS Panzer Regiment I for July 1943 have never been systematically examined by researchers focused on this specific engagement. Not because historians haven't tried, because the Waffen-SS divisional records suffered catastrophic losses in the final weeks of the war. The LSSAH's administrative records were partially destroyed during the retreat from the Eastern Front. Further records were lost in the Berlin Archives bombing of February 1945. What survived was captured by Allied forces, divided between American and Soviet archives, and has only been partially catalogued and declassified over the subsequent decades. The crew roster that would tell us who served under Staudegger on July 8, 1943, may exist in a box in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, or in the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, or in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Or it may have burned in 1945. No researcher has yet found it. The Nazi system of military awards compounded this archival problem with deliberate policy. The Knight's Cross went to Staudegger, not to his gunner, who actually aimed and fired the weapon that destroyed the Soviet tanks, not to his loader, who kept the shells coming during an hour-long engagement, not to his driver, who positioned the vehicle to engage multiple targets, not to his radio operator, who coordinated with other units and contributed to close defense. The propaganda myth required a singular hero, and so 4 men became invisible. They may have survived the war and lived quiet lives, never telling anyone they were present for one of the most celebrated tank engagements of the Eastern Front. They may have been killed in subsequent actions, their names appearing in casualty lists that no researcher has connected to the Staudegger engagement. They may have been captured by Soviet forces, disappeared into the Gulag system, and never returned. Without the archival records, we simply cannot trace them. The absence of crew testimony is devastating for any attempt to verify the engagement. If 4 men besides Staudegger had survived and independently confirmed that yes, they faced 50 Soviet tanks and destroyed 22, the case for historical accuracy would be much stronger. If 1 or more had contradicted the official account, that would be equally significant. What we have instead is silence. The silence of men either dead, deliberately muted by the focus on their commander, or never asked to contribute their perspective. What we can trace are the fates of Staudegger's peers in the Tiger units. Following the Kursk operation, Staudegger was transferred to Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 101, the 101st Heavy SS Tank Battalion. His Tiger carried the number 1325. This placed him in the same company as Michael Wittmann's Tiger 1331 and Helmut Wendorf's Tiger 1321. This concentration of decorated commanders in a single unit made them disproportionately effective, but also disproportionately vulnerable. Helmut Wendorf was born on October 20th, 1920 in Berlin. He was awarded the Knight's Cross on February 12, 1944, for accumulated tank kills on the Eastern Front. He was killed on August 6, 1944, during the brutal fighting in Normandy following the Allied invasion. 23 years old. Michael Wittmann was killed 2 days later, on August 8, 1944, when his Tiger was destroyed near Saint-Aignan-de-Camenil by British or Canadian tanks. The summer of 1944 was catastrophic for the men who had been celebrated as the armoured fist of the Reich. But Franz Staudegger wasn't among the dead. Unlike Wittmann and Wendorf, he walked out of the war alive. The details of his survival, which unit he was serving with in 1945, whether he was captured, where he surrendered, how he was processed through the denazification system, remain unclear in available English-language sources. What is documented is that he returned to Austria and lived an unremarkable civilian life. According to available records, Staudegger worked as an Austrian Federal Railways employee, a quiet, bureaucratic position about as far removed from the dramatic heroism of the Knight's Cross narrative as one could imagine. The man who allegedly destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single day spent his post-war decades working railway schedules in the same Carinthian region where he'd been born. Staudegger died in 1991, age 68, 48 years after the engagement that made him famous. He lived through the Cold War, watched the Berlin Wall go up and come down, witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union in the same year he died. Whether he ever discussed his wartime service publicly, whether he confirmed or complicated the official narrative of his Knight's Cross action, whether he kept contact with any surviving crew members, these questions remain unanswered. Unlike some German veterans who wrote memoirs or gave interviews to military historians, Staudegger appears to have maintained silence about his past. Perhaps he believed the official story. Perhaps he knew better than anyone how uncertain the real events were. Perhaps he simply wanted to leave the war behind and live as an Austrian railway official rather than a former SS tank commander. The Staudegger engagement survives in popular consciousness not because historians have verified it, but because storytellers have repeated it. Military history enthusiasts, documentary producers, video game designers, tank modelers, they've all found the narrative irresistible. The young commander, the impossible odds, the single Tiger holding off a Soviet armoured assault. The story appears in World of Tanks and War Thunder, games featuring millions of active players that regularly highlight historical tank aces in their promotional materials. It appears in documentaries about the Tiger tank, about the Battle of Kursk, about German tank aces as a category. Each repetition reinforces the claim. Each citation points back to the same source. A medal citation written in 48 hours during the chaos of Operation Citadel, by men who needed heroes. So what can we actually know? We know Franz Staudegger was awarded the Knight's Cross on July 10, 1943, for actions 2 days earlier. We know the citation credits him with destroying 22 Soviet tanks. We know this claim has never been independently verified through German unit reports, Soviet casualty records, or battlefield archaeology. We know the Nazi propaganda system had documented practices of exaggerating and fabricating tank ace claims, including in the same battalion where Staudegger served. We know Soviet records from the same sector on the same day don't clearly match the German narrative. But also know Soviet records had their own systematic distortions. We know 4 other men were in that tank, and their names, their fates, their version of events have never been recorded. We know Staudegger survived the war, worked for the Austrian railways, and died in 1991 without leaving any public account of what actually happened that July morning. What we don't know, what we may never know, is whether a 20-year-old Austrian really destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single engagement, or whether the propaganda machines of 2 totalitarian states conspired to create a myth that serves their opposite purposes equally well. The Germans got a superhuman warrior who proved Aryan superiority. The Soviets got silence about a tactical catastrophe that would have embarrassed commanders. Both sides had reasons to lie. Neither left records clean enough to tell us the truth. Maybe that's the most important thing to understand about wartime claims from regimes built on lies. You don't get to choose between Nazi propaganda and Soviet propaganda. You get to recognize that you're probably being lied to by both, and act accordingly. Subscribe for more stories like this.